What are you doing this weekend, babe? Jenna's voice broke the morning stillness, light and casual as she reached into the cabinet for a mug. The sound of coffee pouring into the cup was the only other noise in the room. Andrew lowered the newspaper slightly, glancing over the top, and took a moment to respond, watching her. The way her fingers moved quickly, almost nervously, as she scrolled through her phone with her free hand made his grip tighten on the edges of the paper, a habit he had developed lately without noticing. I don't know, maybe catch a game. He forced himself to sound nonchalant, though inside his mind was racing. He shifted in his seat, fighting interest in the article he had been staring at for the last 10 minutes. You? She didn't look up, her focus still on the phone. Oh, just meeting some friends, girls' night out, she said, her voice a little too casual. She flashed him a quick smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. The smile faded as fast as it appeared, her attention drawn right back to the glowing screen. The moment felt off, like a room slightly out of balance. It was a familiar sensation now. This distance between them was growing more noticeable with each passing week. The once effortless conversations had turned stilted, interrupted by Jenna's distracted nods and her half-answers. Andrew shifted in his chair. His instincts had been tugging at him for a while now. Something unspoken but palpable lingered in the air. It wasn't just the late-night texts or the sudden nights out that she didn't used to have. It was her demeanor, the way she was no longer fully present with him. He tried to shake the feeling, rationalizing it. Maybe it's work stress, he told himself. Or maybe he was just reading too much into things. But deep down he knew better. Who's going? Andrew asked, his eyes on her face now, gauging her reaction. She paused briefly before answering, just long enough for him to catch it. Oh, just the usual, Kim said, shrugging. But the words felt rehearsed, like she had prepared for this question in advance. He nodded slowly, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. He wasn't going to push it right now. His mind was clouded, tangled between suspicion and the desire to trust her. They'd been together for 5 years. They had built a life together. A home. He didn't want to believe she was capable of lying to him, but the buzzing of her phone late into the night echoed in his mind, replaying every time she had brushed it off with a casual excuse. Just Kim again, she'd say. She's going through a breakup, or AL's planning a trip and needs advice. Every explanation felt less convincing as the weeks went by. Jenna turned away from him, leaning against the counter as she texted someone back quickly. Andrew watched her shoulders tense slightly, as if she knew he was observing her. What time will you be home? He asked, keeping his tone neutral, but he could feel his heartbeat picking up. He didn't know what answer he was hoping for, but he felt a strange need to hear it. Not too late, she replied too fast. You know, just a few drinks. We'll probably head back to Kim's place for a bit, but nothing wild. She set her phone down, face down on the counter and took a sip of her coffee, her eyes avoiding his. Andrew nodded again, but inside the unease was growing. It was becoming harder to ignore the signs. He noticed the way her phone was always face down these days, how she never left it unattended. It used to sit on the coffee table or the kitchen counter without a second thought. Now it was always in her hand, or if it wasn't, it was tucked into her bag out of sight. He glanced at his own phone, sitting on the table next to his half-eaten toast. The thought of checking hers crossed his mind for the first time. He hated himself for even considering it, but the doubt was like a dark cloud hanging over him, growing larger with each small lie, each vague answer. Yeah, sounds good, Andrew said, standing up and carrying his plate to the sink. The sound of the dish clattering against the metal rang out louder than it should have in the quiet kitchen. He turned the faucet on, letting the water run over his hands longer than necessary, staring down at the swirl of soap bubbles disappearing down the drain. He felt Jenna's eyes on him now, like she was waiting for something, maybe waiting for him to press further, to ask the question she didn't want to answer. But he didn't, not yet. I'll probably just catch the game like I said, Andrew muttered as he turned off the water and dried his hands on the towel hanging by the sink. He kept his back to her, his mind churning. Sounds like a plan, Jenna said, and he could hear the relief in her voice. She was relieved that he hadn't pushed. He clenched his jaw, his stomach tightening as the pieces of the puzzle started coming together in his head. She wanted him to drop it, to let her slip away without any question. Andrew turned back to face her, leaning against the counter across from her. "You've been going out a lot lately," he said, testing the waters. His voice was calm, but the question hung in the air between them like a heavy fog. Jenna blinked, clearly caught off guard by the directness. "What? No, I mean not really. It's just been a rough couple of weeks at work. I needed to unwind, you know?" She waved her hand like the explanation was obvious, but her eyes darted back to her phone for a split second, betraying her. Andrew said nothing for a moment, watching her, feeling the growing chasm between them. He wasn't sure when the tipping point had arrived, but it was here in this moment where everything started to crack. "Unwind," he repeated softly, letting the word linger. "Yeah, I get that." He gave her a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was playing along for now, but his mind was already racing ahead, planning his next move. "You okay?" Jenna asked, finally looking at him with a hint of concern, but Andrew couldn't tell if it was genuine or just another part of the act. "Yeah, I'm good," he said, nodding slowly. His voice was steady. "Just tired, I guess. Where it's been rough too." Jenna smiled at that, a forced sort of smile, before finishing her coffee and placing the mug in the sink. "Well, I should get going soon. Got a few errands before meeting the girls," she said. "Of course," Andrew replied, his hand sliding into his pocket. His fingers curled into fists as he watched her walk out of the kitchen. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the hallway, the front door clicking shut behind her. Minutes later, Andrew stood there in the silence. The tension in his chest was almost unbearable. Now he glanced at her phone on the counter, knowing it would contain the answers he dreaded. But instead he turned away. There would be time for that later. Today he would wait, watch, and prepare. It was a paranoia that Andrew's business meeting had been cancelled unexpectedly, freeing up his entire night. He found himself driving back home at 3 a.m., feeling a mix of relief and anticipation. He had told Jenna he was coming back early after weeks of strained conversations and distance. He thought maybe surprising her would be a chance to reset things. Maybe he was being too suspicious. Maybe things weren't as bad as they seemed. He parked the car in the driveway and stepped out quietly. The house was dark, except for the faint glow coming from the upstairs bedroom window. He smiled a little to himself, thinking she must have stayed up late reading or watching TV. The thought was comforting, a tiny flicker of hope. But as he slid the key into the front door and gently pushed it open, he heard something he couldn't quite place at first. It was a distant, muffled noise. He stopped. The door barely cracked open. The sound was rhythmic, faint, but unmistakable, a low, almost primal moaning. Andrew stood frozen in the doorway, confusion washing over him. He stepped inside, shutting the door softly behind him. His breathing quickened as he stood in the dark hallway. The noises from upstairs grew clear, a rhythmic thudding sound followed by soft, breathy moans. Jenna's moans. His heart dropped, then pounded in his chest, his pulse ringing in his ears. "No, please no," he whispered under his breath, his stomach twisting violently. His feet felt like lead as he moved toward the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The soft sounds from the bedroom pierced the silence of the house. The creaking floorboards under his feet sounded deafening. Yet the two people upstairs didn't seem to notice anything beyond each other. He reached the top of the stairs, his hands trembling. There was no denying it now. He could hear them clearly. Jenna's voice filled with desire, calling out, "Oh yes, baby, faster. You're the best." The words stabbed into his chest like a blade. Andrew's mind went blank for a moment, a loud buzzing in his ears as if the world around him had faded into static. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. Andrew pushed it open slowly, each second dragging out as if in slow motion. His breath caught in his throat as the door swung inward, revealing what he already feared. There, tangled in the sheets, was Jenna, her body wrapped around a tall, muscular man with dark skin, someone Andrew had never seen before. The man's broad back arched as he moved rhythmically, his hands gripping Jenna's hips tightly. She moaned, eyes shut, lost in her ecstasy, completely unaware that her husband was standing in the doorway. Andrew couldn't move. His eyes were fixated on the scene in front of him, a nightmare come to life. His hands gripped the door frame so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Time seemed to freeze, and the smell of sweat and sex hung in the air, thick and nauseating. For a split second, every instinct screamed at him to react, to yell, to fight. To throw the man out of his home, out of his bed. His fingers twitched as the urge to storm gripped him, but something else held him back. He realized with terrifying clarity that reacting in anger would only give them more power over him. Andrew took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. The room swam around him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him unravel without a sound. He turned and left the room, his feet carrying him down the stairs automatically, each step feeling heavier than the last. The rhythmic thumping continued behind him, as if nothing had changed. It echoed in his mind, fueling his rising anger. But he didn't let it show, not yet. He was shaking now, adrenaline coursing through him. But instead of confronting them, instead of losing control, he made a decision. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, Andrew walked through the living room and into the spare bedroom, where he had kept an old suitcase tucked away in the closet. He yanked it out, throwing it open onto the bed. His hands moved mechanically, grabbing clothes from his drawers and stuffing them into the bag with methodical precision. Each piece of clothing dropped into the suitcase with a dull thud of finality. He walked to the dresser and pulled open the top drawer. Inside lay a set of neatly folded divorce papers, which he had prepared months ago, just in case his worst suspicions were ever confirmed. He stared at them for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The papers felt cold and lifeless in his hands, but at that moment, they were the most powerful weapon he had. As he packed, his mind raced through the events of the last few weeks, every late-night text she had brushed off, every excuse about girls' night, every cold, distant conversation. They all fell into place now. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, but he pushed the emotions aside. There would be time for grief later. Now there was only clarity. When his suitcase was full, Andrew zipped it up and carried it downstairs. He sat by the front door and then paused, staring at the spot where his keys usually hung on the wall. His hands hovered over them for a moment before dropping to his sides. He wasn't leaving just yet, not without one final move. Andrew walked back upstairs, stopping just outside the bedroom. The sounds of their affair still filled the house, the bed creaking under the weight of their betrayal. But he didn't need to look again. He knew exactly what was happening. With steady hands he took out his phone, opened the camera, and snapped a photo of the slightly open door and the two bodies intertwined inside. He didn't need a video or a dramatic confrontation. This photo, along with the divorce papers, would be enough to end this chapter of his life on his terms. He turned away, walking back downstairs for the last time. There was no satisfaction in what he had seen, only a deep, cold emptiness. But underneath that emptiness was resolve. A resolve to move on, to leave the life he thought he had behind. The front door clicked softly as Andrew stepped out into the night, suitcase in hand. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. As he drove away, the image of Jenna in bed with another man burned in his mind. It would stay with him, he knew that much, but it wouldn't control him, not anymore. The house disappeared in the rearview mirror, and with it, the last remnants of the life he had built with her. All that was left now was to see this through. The soft morning light crept into the bedroom, filtering through the half-drawn blinds. Jenna stirred, her body still entangled in the sheets from last night. Her eyes fluttered open as the sound of a zipper cut through the silence, jarring her from her sleep. Groggy and disoriented, she pushed herself up on her elbows, trying to make sense of her surroundings. She blinked a few times, her vision adjusting, and saw Andrew standing at the closet, methodically folding his shirts and placing them into a suitcase. Panic began to rise in her chest as her heart raced. "What the heck are you doing?" Jenna's voice cracked with panic, her tone sharp as she scrambled out of bed, clutching the sheets to her chest as if they could somehow shield her from the reality unfolding before her. She rushed toward him, her eyes wide with confusion. Andrew didn't even look up at first, his hands continuing to fold his clothes neatly, his movements deliberate, calm. When he finally raised his eyes to meet hers, his face was emotionless, unyielding, composed. "I got home this morning and saw that big, dark delivery guy passionately doing you," he said, his voice steady, almost detached. "Judging by how you were shouting, 'Oh yes, baby, you're the best,' faster, I figured I shouldn't get in the way of your special delivery." Jenna's breath caught in her throat as the color drained from her face. She stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing, her world collapsing in on itself. She tried to speak but no words came out, her lips were trembling. Andrew, without missing a beat, reached into his suitcase and pulled out a set of papers, tossing them onto the bed without a glance. Here are the divorce papers. The room seemed to tilt on its axis as Jenna's legs gave out beneath her. She dropped to her knees, the sheets falling from her grasp as she clung to Andrew's legs, sobbing uncontrollably. Please Andrew, I'm sorry. Her voice was raw, desperate. It was a mistake, I swear. Please don't leave me, she pleaded, her fingers digging into the fabric of his pants. Her tears streamed down her face in hot, messy trails. The weight of her body pressed against him, but Andrew didn't budge. He looked down at her, his expression unchanged, his eyes cold. A mistake, he echoed, the words dripping with sarcasm as he tilted his head slightly. You don't accidentally fall into bed with someone. You made a choice, Jenna. You've been making choices for a while now, haven't you? His voice hardened as he continued. All those late nights, the secrecy, the lies. But you know what? This isn't my problem anymore. With deliberate calmness, Andrew reached down and pried her hands from his legs, peeling her fingers away one by one with little effort. Jenna's sobs grew louder, her body trembling as she reached for him again, her nails scraping against the floor in a futile attempt to hold on to him. Please, please, Andrew, I'll do anything. Just give me a chance to explain. It was stupid, I wasn't thinking. Her words tumbled out in a frantic rush, her voice cracking as she searched his face for any sign of forgiveness. Andrew remained unmoved. Explain, he asked, his voice sharp, cutting through her pleas like a knife. What is there to explain, Jenna? I walked in on you. You didn't even know I was there, did you? He shook his head slowly, the corners of his mouth twitching in a bitter smile. You were so caught up in your little affair, so busy screaming his name that you didn't even hear me come in. Jenna's sobs became more frantic. Her breath came in ragged gasps. I wasn't thinking, Andrew, she said. I made a horrible mistake, but I love you. I swear I love you. She reached for his hand, but Andrew pulled it back, his expression hardening further. Love, Andrew repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. You call that love? Sneaking around behind my back for months, lying to my face, and then bringing some random guy into our bed? That's not love, Jenna. That's betrayal. Jenna's face contorted in agony. Her eyes were wide with fear and regret. I didn't mean to hurt you. I wasn't thinking. Please, I'll do anything to fix this. We can go to counseling, we can talk, anything. Just please don't leave me. Andrew's patience was wearing thin. He stepped back, putting more distance between them as Jenna's hands fell to her sides, limp and defeated. This isn't something you fix, Jenna. You don't fix this with words or counseling or promises. You broke us. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at her. And the worst part is, you didn't even have the decency to come clean. I had to catch you. You would have kept lying, wouldn't you? Jenna shook her head furiously, her voice barely a whisper now. No, I was going to tell you. I swear I was just scared. The lie was weak, even to her own ears, and she knew it. Andrew's laugh was hollow, humorless. Scared? You weren't scared when you were with him. You weren't scared while you were lying to me over and over again. He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. I was scared, Jenna. Scared that something was wrong. Scared that maybe I wasn't enough. But not you. You were just having fun. Living in your little fantasy. He leaned down slightly, his voice dropping lower. But that's all over now. Jenna looked up at him, her face wet with tears, her lips quivering as she tried to find the words to make him stay. I'll never do it again, I swear. Please, Andrew, just one more chance. I'll prove it to you. I'll show you I can change. Her words were barely audible now, her voice hoarse from crying. Andrew sighed, shaking his head slowly. It's too late for that, Jenna. You already made your choice. You chose him, not me. You chose lies and betrayal over our marriage. He turned away from her, walking toward the door as he picked up his suitcase. Andrew, please, she screamed, her voice breaking as she crawled after him, her fingers clutching the carpet as if she could physically pull him back. Don't leave me, please. I'll die without you. Andrew paused at the door, his hand resting on the doorknob. He turned back one last time, his face blank, devoid of the love and warmth that had once been there. You should have thought about that before you let him into our bed." With that, he opened the door and walked out, leaving Jenna crumpled on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed in the now silent house, a final irreversible end to what was once their life together. The weight of the last few hours pressed down on him, but as he breathed in the fresh air, a strange sense of calm washed over him. It was over finally. It was over. Andrew stepped out of the house that morning, the door closing behind him with a soft click that echoed in the stillness of the early hours. The suitcase in his hand felt lighter than it should have, but the weight of his next steps pressed heavily on his mind. His heart was cold, devoid of the turmoil that had raged inside him when he first walked in on Jenna's betrayal. Now all that was left was the clarity of a plan he had meticulously crafted in the days since discovering her affair. Walking to his car, Andrew didn't feel sadness or regret. Instead, he felt a strange sense of control. He wasn't just leaving Jenna. He was going to dismantle her life piece by piece, leaving her with nothing but the wreckage of her own choices. The first step of his plan was already in motion as soon as he had walked out of that bedroom, leaving Jenna sobbing on the floor. He had sent the divorce papers to his lawyer, along with the evidence of her infidelity. The legal battle ahead would be swift and merciless. Andrew made sure that every detail of her affair was documented, photos, messages, timestamps. There would be no room for her to contest anything. In the days that followed, Jenna had tried reaching out to him. Her calls and texts came in a frantic flood, but Andrew ignored them all, letting her desperation grow. He knew her well enough to predict her every move. She would try to manipulate him, beg him, even guilt him into reconsidering, but he wasn't interested in her apologies. This was beyond forgiveness. 2 weeks after he left, the divorce papers were officially filed with the evidence he had submitted. Jenna was left with nothing. The prenup they had signed before their marriage, something Andrew had insisted on, was ironclad. She wouldn't get a single penny from him, not the house, not the cars, not the savings. Everything she had become so accustomed to, the life of comfort and luxury he had provided, was now slipping through her fingers like sand. Andrew made sure of that. The house, which had been bought in his name before they got married, remained his. Jenna had no legal claim to it. Her car was repossessed. He had made the call to the dealership as soon as the divorce was filed. Within days, it was gone from the driveway, leaving her stranded. He froze the joint accounts, ensuring she wouldn't be able to access a dime. She had no job, no income of her own, and now no way to support herself. He heard through the grapevine that Jenna had been forced to move in with a friend. That same friend, who had gossiped to others about Jenna's perfect marriage, was now housing the woman whose life had fallen apart so spectacularly. But Andrew wasn't done. The financial devastation was only the beginning. He wanted to make sure Jenna's social life crumbled just as completely as her finances. He wanted everyone to know the truth. He started with her friends, the women she spent her girls' nights with. Andrew sent an anonymous message to each of them, attaching the photo he had taken the night he walked in on her and her lover. He didn't need to write much, just enough to let them know what Jenna had been doing behind his back. Thought you might want to know what Jenna was really up to on those late nights. That was all it took. The photo did the rest. Within days, her friends began to distance themselves. Whispers spread through her social circle, some cutting eyes immediately, others too shocked to know how to react. Jenna tried to explain, tried to spin the story in her favor, but there was no escaping the truth. The photo was undeniable. Next he turned to her family. He had always been close to her parents, especially her mother, who had adored him like a son. When he sat down with them, his tone was calm but direct. He told them everything, every lie, every betrayal, every detail of her affair. Her mother wept, unable to comprehend how her daughter had destroyed the life she had been given. Her father, a stern man who valued loyalty above all else, sat in stony silence, his disappointment palpable. Jenna's family, who had once been her greatest support system, now looked at her with disgust. Her father refused to speak to her, and her mother could barely meet her eyes. Andrew had taken away not only her financial stability but also her family's respect. Finally there were the mutual acquaintances, people they had known together, friends they had made as a couple. Andrew didn't need to do much here. Word had already spread like wildfire, thanks to the messages he had sent to Jenna's friends. By the time he saw any of them again, the damage was done. Every awkward glance, every whispered conversation as he walked into a room, told him that Jenna's reputation was in shambles. It didn't take long for her lover's life to fall apart as well. Andrew had made sure to find out everything he could about the man Jenna had betrayed him with, a delivery guy, someone she had met through one of her friends who worked for a career service. It was easy enough to send the evidence of the affair to his employer. A few days later, Andrew heard through a mutual connection that the guy had been fired. It wasn't just about exposing him. It was about making sure he lost everything too. As the weeks passed, Jenna's once perfect life disintegrated. She went from living in a beautiful house with a husband who adored her to sleeping on a friend's couch, jobless, penniless, and ostracized by the people she once called friends. The lover she had risked everything for was gone. Their brief fling dissolving under the pressure of real-life consequences. No more late-night texts, no more secret meetups. He had disappeared just as quickly as he had come into her life. Andrew's plan had worked. Jenna had nothing left. Every corner she returned to, every attempt to rebuild her life, was met with failure. She couldn't get a job without transportation. She couldn't move on without a support system. And the divorce, finalized within months, left her with nothing but the clothes on her back. As for Andrew, he moved on. He found solace in his newfound freedom. A life unburdened by lies and deceit. The house that once felt suffocating now felt like a sanctuary. A place where he could rebuild without the ghost of Jenna haunting every room. He didn't look back. There was no reason to. Jenna, on the other hand, was left to pick up the pieces of the life she had shattered. She had underestimated Andrew, thinking she could manipulate her way back into his good graces. But he had seen through her plans, and his revenge was carefully executed, leaving her with nothing. In the end, it wasn't the affair itself that destroyed her. It was Andrew's cold, calculated dismantling of everything she had taken for granted. As the months passed, Andrew lived happily, free from the weight of betrayal, while Jenna and her former lover were left to suffer the consequences of their choices. "Andrew, please, I don't have anywhere to go." Jenna's voice came through the phone, raw and desperate. It was cracked with the weight of tears, so different from the confident, carefree tone she once used. Now her words were drenched in fear, uncertainty, and the unmistakable stench of regret. Andrew sat in the sleek leather chair by the window of his new condo, his hand clutching the phone loosely. The sun was setting over the city skyline, casting a warm orange glow across the modern minimalist furniture that filled his new life. It was calm here, peaceful the way he had always wanted it. He glanced at the phone. Jenna's voice was a distant echo, barely stirring any emotion inside him. "You should have thought of that before you invited him into our bed," Jenna. Andrew responded, his tone as cold as the steel frame of the skyscraper he now called home. Without waiting for her reply, he hung up, tossing the phone onto the coffee table in front of him. He sighed and leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. The sounds of the city buzzed faintly from far below, but they felt distant, detached, like the remnants of another life, a life he had shed. He was free now. Andrew's mind drifted back to the weeks following the divorce. Jenna had called him relentlessly in the beginning. Her voice always the same, pleading, apologizing, asking for another chance. He had stopped answering after a while. There was no point. The damage was done. The trust was broken. He had given her everything and she had thrown it away. Now Jenna's life was a shell of what it once was. The last he had heard from a mutual acquaintance, she was living in a rundown apartment on the edge of town, scraping by with a dead-end job at some retail store. Her lover had abandoned her almost as soon as the divorce was finalized, leaving her with nothing but shattered pride and mounting regret. Jenna had always taken their life together for granted. The fancy dinners, the weekend getaways, the financial security. None of it had mattered to her as much as her reckless, selfish desires. Now, all of that was gone, and Andrew had made sure she felt the full weight of her choices. He stood up from the chair and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing out at the glittering lights of the city. His new condo was high above it all, far removed from the chaos below. The silence was a welcome change from the tension and mistrust that had filled his home during the last few months of their marriage. He hadn't realized how suffocated he had felt until the day he packed his bags and left. There was no one to lie to him here, no one to hide behind fake smiles and empty words. He had rebuilt his life in the way he wanted, surrounded by honesty and simplicity. It was all so different from the whirlwind of deceit and betrayal that had consumed his marriage. As he stood there, his phone buzzed again. It was Jenna. Andrew sighed, his fingers hovering over the screen before he pressed ignore. He wasn't interested in hearing more of her apologies. They were meaningless. He knew what she really wanted. Her old life back, the life he had built for her. But that life was gone now, and it wasn't coming back. Later that evening, Andrew met up with a few colleagues for dinner. They laughed, shared stories, and for the first time in what felt like years, Andrew wasn't pretending to be fine. He was fine, better than fine actually. He had moved on, and it showed. The tension that had once lined his face had disappeared, replaced by a calm confidence that hadn't been there in years. "You look different, man, happier," one of his friends commented as they clinked their glasses together. Andrew smiled. "Yeah, I feel different. A lot has changed, but it's been for the better." As the night went on, Andrew felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He wasn't the same man who had walked in on his wife's betrayal that night. He was stronger, clearer, and no longer bound by the hurt she had caused. But for Jenna, things hadn't improved. Every now and then, Andrew heard snippets of her life through mutual acquaintances. The stories were always the same. She was struggling alone, her friends had distanced themselves, unable or unwilling to get involved in the mess she had made. Her job was grueling, and she barely made enough to cover rent and groceries. One day, Andrew ran into one of Jenna's old friends, Emily, at a coffee shop downtown. Emily had been one of the few friends who had known about Jenna's affair but kept her distance from the fallout. She hesitated before approaching him, as if unsure how to start the conversation. "Andrew, how are you?" she asked, awkwardly fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "I'm good, Emily. How about you?" Andrew replied, sipping his coffee calmly. Emily's eyes shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "I ran into Jen the other day. She's not doing well." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "I figured as much," she asked. "About you?" Emily continued, lowering her voice. "She's really sorry, Andrew. She regrets everything." "Should," Andrew replied without missing a beat. "But that's her problem now, not mine." Emily nodded, biting her lip. "I get it. I just thought you should know." After a brief awkward exchange, Emily left, and Andrew went on with his day. Jenna's regret didn't matter to him anymore. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. There was no going back. A few months later, as winter set in, Andrew received one last voicemail from Jenna. He hadn't heard from her in weeks, and he assumed she had finally given up trying to reach him. But this message was different. "Andrew, I wanted to say that I'm sorry. I know I've said it before, but this time I mean it. I've lost everything, and I know it's my fault. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I just wanted you to know that I miss you. I miss us." Her voice was quiet, defeated. Andrew listened to the message, then calmly deleted it. He wasn't angry anymore, in fact he felt nothing. Jenna was a part of his past now, and that chapter was closed. He looked out at the city from his condo, the lights twinkling in the distance. Life had moved on, and as Jenna's voice faded into the ether, Andrew realized that he was finally free. Jenna's life, on the other hand, was a constant reminder of what she had lost. While Andrew thrived, Jenna struggled, forever haunted by the choices she had made. Months had passed since the day Andrew walked out of his old life. The raw pain of betrayal had dulled into something manageable. And now, as he sat at a cafe sipping his coffee, the weight of that chapter had lifted. The sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the cozy ambience of the cafe. There was a time when Andrew would have sat here, distracted, lost in thoughts of Jenna, wondering where it all went wrong, but not anymore. Today he felt a deep sense of peace, like a calm after a long storm. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, watching the steady swirl of liquid in his cup. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket, but he didn't check it. He had set firm boundaries in place. No more calls from Jenna, no more lingering reminders of the life he had left behind. The few times she tried to contact him, Her messages were filled with apologies, regrets, and a desperation that only deepened as time went on. But Andrew had let go of that burden. He wasn't bitter anymore. He wasn't angry. In fact, he was grateful. Grateful that he had seen the truth, that he had the courage to walk away, and most importantly, that he had found himself again. He took another sip of his coffee, savoring the bitter taste as a soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Andrew looked up, meeting the eyes of a woman standing in front of him. She was holding a cup of coffee in one hand and balancing a laptop in the other. Her expression was warm, her smile kind and open. "No, go ahead," he said, motioning to the empty chair across from him. She sat down with a grateful nod, placing her things on the table. Andrew glanced at her briefly before returning to his coffee, but after a few moments, the silence between them felt oddly comfortable, like a soft background hum rather than the awkward stillness that sometimes hangs between strangers. "It was a busy day," she asked, offering him a casual smile as she settled into her chair. Andrew shrugged. "Not really, just enjoying some time off." "I wish I could say the same," she replied with a chuckle. "I'm swamped with work, but I needed a change of scenery." She gestured toward her laptop. "Working remotely isn't as glamorous as it sounds." Andrew smiled at her comment, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, sometimes getting out of the house helps clear the mind." As the conversation unfolded, Andrew found himself enjoying the simplicity of it. There was no tension, no hidden agenda. Just two people sharing a moment over coffee. The woman, her name was Anna, was easy to talk to. She had a light, easygoing nature about her. And as they talked, Andrew felt something stir within him that he hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. Not just freedom from Jenna and the baggage of their broken relationship, but freedom to open himself up to new possibilities, to trust someone again. It wasn't that he had been avoiding people in the months since the divorce, but Andrew had kept to himself, focusing on healing and rebuilding his life. Now, sitting here with Anna, he realized something. He was free to build something new, something real with someone who might actually respect him. Their conversation meandered from work to hobbies, from the best local restaurants to favorite travel destinations. Anna's laugh was infectious, and Andrew found himself smiling more than he had in a while. She wasn't prim. She wasn't trying to fill the gaps of silence with unnecessary chatter, and it felt refreshing. "So, Andrew, what about you? What brings you here today?" she asked after a brief lull in the conversation, taking a sip of her coffee. "Just needed a break from the routine," he replied honestly. "I've had some big changes in my life recently, so I'm just enjoying the quiet moments when I can." She raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued, but she didn't push for more. "Sounds like a smart move. Life has a way of pulling you in all directions, doesn't it?" "It sure does," Andrew said, the understatement making him chuckle. He thought back to the chaos of the past year. The emotional roller coaster of discovering Jenna's betrayal, the drawn-out divorce, and the slow, deliberate process of reclaiming his life. "But sometimes those changes are for the best," Anna smiled softly, as if understanding exactly what he meant. "That's a good way to look at it. I think a lot of people struggle with letting go, but once you do, it's freeing." Andrew nodded in agreement, his thoughts drifting back to Jenna briefly, but only for a moment. She was just a distant memory now, a part of his past that no longer had any hold over him. He wasn't sure where she was or what she was doing, but from what he had heard, things hadn't gone well for her. Her affair partner had moved on quickly, leaving her in the mess they had both created. Andrew had moved on while Jenna was still stuck, trapped by the consequences of her choice. But that was no longer Andrew's concern. He had his life back, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As the hours passed, Anna glanced at her watch and frowned slightly. "I should probably get going," she said. "But this has been really nice. I don't usually have such good conversations in coffee shops." She smiled. Gathering her things, "I agree," Andrew said, standing up as she did. "It was great meeting you, Anna." She paused, looking at him for a moment, her smile widening just a bit. "Maybe we could do this again sometime if you're free, of course." Andrew hesitated for a second, but then the words came easily. "Yeah, I like that." They exchanged numbers, and as Anna walked out of the cafe, Andrew felt a warmth spread through him. It wasn't the kind of intense, overwhelming feeling that he had once associated with love or relationships, but something gentler, more grounded, something real. Andrew finished the last of his coffee, setting the cup down on the table before standing up to leave. As he walked out into the cool evening air, he realized that Jenna's betrayal wasn't something that defined him anymore. It had been a turning point, a painful lesson, but ultimately it had set him free. Now he had a new chapter to look forward to, one filled with possibilities. And as he walked through the bustling streets, Andrew couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of triumph. He had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and most importantly, happy. Jenna and her lover might still be stuck in the mess they had created, but Andrew, he had moved on. He had won.